All right, everyone, welcome back. It's my pleasure to introduce our next panel with two speakers, Tara Wells and Ashley Lance. First of all, let me introduce Tara, who will be giving a paper entitled "The Dangers of Reception, Harmful Uses of Classical Art for the Oppression and Othering of Indigenous Americans, Why It Matters." Tara Wells, her, is a third-year PhD student in classical studies at Duke University, pursuing a concentration in archaeology. Tara received an MA from the University of Maryland, College Park in 2020, and a BA from Oberlin College in 2018, both in Latin and Greek. Tara is also an alumna of the Centro program. Tara is interested broadly in identity and antiquity, especially representations of marginalized identities from the classical world, both of the self and of others. She aspires to use interdisciplinary approaches to consider how and why people present themselves or others certain ways across different sources, such as text and material culture. Tara is also devoted to making the study of classics in academia at large more accessible and inclusive of traditionally underrepresented identities in the field. In this capacity, she currently serves on the Mountaintop Coalition Steering Committee. And it's my pleasure now to hand things over to Tara.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here. Good morning. I will go ahead and share my screen and get started. Okay, so hopefully that is coming through. Yeah. So Indigenous peoples of the Americas are frequently featured in 19th century American art, promoting negative ethnic stereotypes and dangerous white supremacist ideals. Such artworks generally feature Indigenous leaders as, quote, noble savages, often in moments of death and as victims of conquest, styling them as both noble enough to be worthy of conquest, while being primitive and savage enough to justify the conqueror's violent actions. I argue that this concept of the dying noble savage has strong precedence in the ancient world, and that these artworks of Indigenous peoples are generally inspired by the ideology of the other in antiquity, and inspired directly by ancient artworks that promote this ideology. For example, the statue of the dying Tecumseh, even in its name, is clearly referencing the famous ancient statue by the modern title of the dying Gaul. Beyond the name, the statue similarly depicts a dying man with his ethnically stereotypical weapons at hand and other aspects such as hair and accessories, styled in such a way to emphasize the ethnic identity of the other on display. In this paper, I aim to present several examples of statues of dying Indigenous peoples of the Americas as dangerous instances of reception of ancient art. I argue that these examples serve to reinforce the oppression and marginalization of Indigenous peoples of the Americas and to justify the European conquest and colonization of the Americas by styling the Indigenous inhabitants as others and as noble savages who deserved the horrendous mistreatment they have been subjected to by European settlers. Additionally, I argue that it is necessary and important for scholars of the ancient world to recognize and condemn these dangerous receptions of classical art in order to reckon with the past and hopefully to prevent further such uses of classical sources to promote harmful ideologies such as that of the noble savage. I do not attempt to argue that the statues themselves should be destroyed or even removed from display, but I do believe that the way the statues continue to be received by their respective catalogs only maintains the problematic nature of the works and further perpetuates the dangerous ideals presented by the sculptures in the first place. And therefore, I argue that we should change the way we receive these artworks, instead of merely accepting and even praising them as noble savages, recognizing the harm such a reception causes and discussing why exactly they are harmful. I begin by reviewing some key examples of the noble savage in antiquity so that we can understand the origins of the ideology of othering based on ethnic identity. I then turn to examples of modern artworks, which I see as receptions of these ancient artworks and harmful ideas. And I conclude with final remarks on the dangers of such reception, and I advocate for the importance of this kind of work for scholars of the ancient world in particular. Let's begin with the ancient material that provides the basis for the ideology of the other in general, and in more specific cases, the noble savage. While the concepts of othering and the noble savage plainly go hand in hand, I do distinguish between the two, with othering as simply styling someone as other, strange or unfamiliar, or simply different, because of some aspect of identity, whether ethnicity, gender, or other aspects of identity, while the concept of the noble savage suggests a specific use of the other for justifying conquest over a group of peoples who are ethnically different from the conquerors and more primitive, less civilized than the conquerors. Scholars of the art of the ancient world are likely aware of the famous statue of the dying Gaul as a primary example of the trope of the noble savage. The heavily restored Roman marble statue, thought to be a likely copy of a Hellenistic bronze original, is housed today in the Capitoline Museum in Rome and presents a dying nude male on the ground, bent over a bleeding wound and surrounded by Celtic arms and armor that distinguish him as a Gaul, also sometimes called a Galatian or a Celt. The figure is also identifiable as a Gaul by his prominent mustache, hair and shaggy disheveled locks, and the torque worn around his neck. The dying warrior looks downward, perhaps at his open wound, with an expression of pain on his face. All these aspects together make the figure a key example of the noble savage. The stereotypical ethnic features of the mustache, hair, torque, and arms identify the figure as an ethnic other, a primitive savage in the eyes of the Romans with respect to the Roman copy, and probably in the eyes of the Attalids of Pergamon with respect to the original sculpture. The sculpture is also noble, however, depicted as a valiant warrior, rendered in the heroic nude, and with an overall idealized form with careful attention to details to make the figure all the more marvelous to stand in awe of. While the dying Gaul is often seen in this light as a primary example of the noble savage, Kimberly Cassabri rightly notes that this statue is not the only instance of this ethnic stereotype, and that equal attention should be given to other examples of dying Gauls. Cassabri analyzes such examples depicted on various media, such as coinage and other sculptural works, including sarcophagi and temple pediments. Here, the figures are similarly identified as Gauls by their mustaches, disheveled hair, torques, and armor. Cassabri makes the case that these are ethnic stereotypes, as they are not the same ways in which Gauls depicted themselves based on occurrences of Gallic self-representation we have preserved through Gallic grave stealing. The numerous examples of this ethnic stereotype thus promote widely the idea of Gauls as noble savages, valiant warriors and worthwhile to be conquered, but uncivilized enough to justify the conquest. And certainly we see other instances of the noble savage in antiquity. Gauls are not the only ones subject to this representation, but for our purposes, a focus on dying Gauls is particularly relevant as it brings us to the modern statues inspired by the statue of the dying Gaul itself. Probably less familiar to us than the dying Gaul is the 1856 sculpture by Ferdinand Petrick of the dying Tecumseh, now housed in the Smithsonian American Art Museum. This sculpture is a fictional depiction of an actual Shawnee warrior-in-chief, Tecumseh, in his dying moments as the result of a bullet wound visible on his forehead. The historical figure of Tecumseh was killed by American soldiers in the War of 1812 and was a great Indigenous leader responsible for uniting a coalition of Indigenous nations to attempt to prohibit white settlers from further invading their Western territory. The sculpture is instantly recognizable for taking inspiration from the dying Gaul, with the figure's reclining pose and being caught in a painful moment of death. Different than the dying Gaul, Tecumseh's head is tilted backwards, but the figures share painful facial expressions and slouched posture, although twisted in different directions. Like the dying Gaul, the dying Tecumseh is ethnically identifiable because of stereotypical features, including a mohawk hairstyle, an armband on the right bicep, tomahawk held in his right hand, and Indigenous clothing with feathers. Just as with the dying Gaul, here Tecumseh is distinguished by stereotypical aspects of appearance and accessories, including arms. He is markedly savage with his weapon of a tomahawk and his other Indigenous attributes, but he is also noble, being dignified in his posture and idealized in overall form, clearly a strong, muscular warrior. The Smithsonian American Art Museum's online catalog entry for the dying Tecumseh makes a direct reference to the dying Gaul statue, stating that it, quote, similarly portrays a military adversary as heroic, yet exotic and powerless. A fictive portrait, it mythologizes Tecumseh as a timeless, noble savage, dangerously and erroneously suggesting that his death and the rapacious expansion of the United States were inevitable, end quote. And I would add that the conquest of the Americas is not only depicted as inevitable here, but also as justified, as is often the case in the trope of the noble savage. While the catalog entry notes that the sculpture has dangerous implications, it does not discuss why it is dangerous, who is harmed by it, or the importance of recognizing this harm. A key word of the catalog description is that the statue mythologizes Tecumseh, constructing him and other Indigenous peoples as things of the past, no longer extant and certainly unimportant in the larger picture of the world. The effect of this is detrimental for the representation of Indigenous peoples of the Americas in a few ways. Firstly, it casts them as nothing more than an impediment to the European conquest of the Americas, denying them any positive attributes or recognition of their mattering or belonging in this world. Additionally, it ignores the fact that Indigenous peoples are living beings still present today. By failing to explicitly acknowledge these detrimental effects of the statue, the catalog text only upholds the white supremacist message of the sculpture. Simply noting the dangerous nature of the artwork is not enough, even if it might prompt viewers to think about the deeper meaning of the piece, because the viewers will still continue to see the statue through the lens of the American white supremacist ideology that is encoded within the artwork itself. It is crucial that instead we take the extra time or space to fully identify the problems, to ensure that we understand the magnitude of their impact and that we are aware of who exactly is being negatively impacted. Otherwise, we aren't accurately recording the history, recognizing its consequences, or communicating the significance of the information we are providing to viewers of the sculpture. This is ultimately doing a disservice to both the viewers of the art and the Indigenous peoples who are negatively affected by it. Furthermore, considering the museum context of the display, we are failing to fulfill our roles as historians and stewards of the past. This all applies beyond the museum context as well. Although the sculpture of Tecumseh now sits in the Smithsonian, it first stood in the US Capitol from 1864 to 1878, a particularly tumultuous time for the US mistreatment of Indigenous Americans, with mass relocation of Indigenous peoples onto reservations. This placement of the sculpture in the country's capital building reveals the impact of artwork in general on people's ideological beliefs and further highlights the negative effects of this statue in particular, expressing the idea that the Indigenous peoples of the Americas deserve to be as violently treated as they have been by the American government. The placement of the statue in the Capitol served as a reinforcement of the American government's view of Indigenous Americans as others in their own lands, noble savages deserving and even in need of violent treatment, slaughter, displacement, and cultural assimilation to turn them into more civilized peoples, more like their conquerors, but also obedient to their conquerors. Victims held hostage again in their own lands. Through the statue of the dying Tecumseh, it is clear that these dangerous ideals are rooted in the idea of the other and the noble savage in antiquity, with this sculpture intentionally emulating the ancient sculpture of the dying Gaul. This reveals the harmful reception of classical art for the purpose of further oppressing and marginalizing Indigenous peoples of the Americas. The sculpture of the dying Tecumseh directly ties modern American white supremacist ideals to similarly problematic ideals of ethnic othering and the conquest of the noble savage in the ancient world. The statue of Tecumseh has been likened to, quote, an expiring Hector, end quote, tying the statue to the ancient epic cycle of the Trojan War and its supposedly great heroes. And Tecumseh himself was eulogized as a, quote, red Hannibal Napoleon, end quote, referencing the great Carthaginian enemy of the Romans, all allusions which demonstrate that these connections with the ancient world were present in the minds of the people commemorating Tecumseh as a noble savage. The museum catalog participates directly in these ideals, noting Tecumseh's reputation as, quote, one of those uncommon geniuses, end quote, citing Tecumseh's valor as strange and unexpected, furthering the idea that he is a particularly noble Indigenous person. Just as the dying Gaul is not the only example of a depiction of the noble savage in antiquity, the dying Tecumseh is not the only instance of the dangerous reception of classical art. Other examples, including Peter Stevenson's The Wounded Indian and Thomas Crawford's The Indian, the Dying Chief Contemplating the Progress of Civilization, offer identical colonialist messages. In Stevenson's The Wounded Indian, on view in the Chrysler Museum of Art in Norfolk, Virginia, we see a wounded Indigenous warrior kneeling on the ground, holding an arrow which has pierced his right leg. There is also a wound bleeding from the figure's torso. The torso wound, along with the kneeling, bent over posture of the figure and the presence of an Indigenous weapon, all recall aspects of the dying Tecumseh and the dying Gaul. The label text for the wounded Indian reads that, quote, many would have understood his tragic demise as a consequence of white settlers' lust for wealth and Indians' failure to conform to civilized customs, end quote. Thus, we see another instance of a sculpture attempting to justify the cultural genocide waged against Indigenous peoples of the Americas, as if it was the fault of the Indigenous peoples for their, quote, failure to conform, end quote, and their stubbornness in their too primitive ways of life. The catalog entry states that the neoclassical sculpture, quote, embodies grace and dignity and evokes empathy and a sense of loss, end quote. Therefore, we see again the trope of the noble savage presented through this reception of classical art and its catalog description, showing a brave and strong warrior who is objectified and on display as an exotic yet noble figure for viewers to marvel at, while also feeling sadness and perhaps a sense of colonial pride for the successful European conquest over the first inhabitants of the soil of the Americas. In Crawford's The Indian, the Dying Chief Contemplating the Progress of Civilization, now housed in the New York Historical Society's museum, we see a similar display of a noble savage. The statue features an Indigenous chief, identified ethnically by the feathers on his head and the tomahawk by his side, seated and bent over with, quote, despair and profound grief resulting from the conviction of the white man's triumph, end quote, according to the artist himself as the goal of the sculpture. Just as the dying Tecumseh held a prominent place in the US Capitol for some time, the original version of this dying chief constitutes part of Crawford's sculptural program called The Progress of Civilization in the east pediment of the entrance to the US Capitol, constructed from 1856 to 1863. As the online catalog entry states, this, quote, problematic work advances the popular 19th century belief in manifest destiny and the inevitable expiration of Indigenous culture in the face of white American progress, end quote. Thus, the sculpture alone promotes white supremacist ideals and justifies the conquest of the Indigenous peoples of the Americas for the sake of white civilization's advancement and success. Within the context of the wider sculptural program for the Capitol's pediment, Crawford's art furthermore draws connections to ancient ideology, with the central figure of the pediment being a personification of America, dressed in flowing classical style drapery and holding laurel wreaths, symbols of classical triumph, with her and the progress of white civilization triumphant over the Indigenous peoples of the Americas. With her gaze directed towards the Indigenous side of the piece, the pediment places America, representing civilized progress, on the side of the white people, who are dismantling the land of the Indigenous peoples who are featured as the suffering victims of the sculptural program. This design of the US Capitol is also cited as attempting to rival the Greek Parthenon, following the style of the Parthenon's own sculptor Phidias. Crawford's art thus establishes the white people as inheritors of the classical world and its ideology, thereby othering Indigenous peoples in art and in governmental policies of the time. Ultimately, in these three statues of Indigenous peoples, only a few key examples out of numerous other examples of the same subjects, we see the dangerous reception of classical art hard at work. These statues ultimately serve to further oppress and marginalize the Indigenous peoples of the Americas, and to justify the violent mistreatment of these peoples for the benefit of the white colonizers of the Americas. The sculptures put Indigenous peoples on display for the viewer's pleasure, thus exoticizing, fetishizing, and objectifying the Indigenous peoples as artworks to be marveled at and commemorated as victims of justified conquest, rather than as human beings who have faced endless mistreatment in their own lands. The statues themselves are displayed in ways that viewers are encouraged to gaze upon them, circling them or even standing above them on stairs to look down on them, as in the case of the dying Tecumseh. Additionally, as Charmaine Nelson argues, the quote, insistence on the whiteness of marble in sculptural practice is also a colonial insistence on the universality of the white body and skin as the aesthetic paradigm of beauty and morality in art, end quote. Furthermore, the intentional absence of color makes subjects of color, quote, more palatable to a dominantly white viewing audience, end quote. Thus, the whiteness of the sculptures contributes to the power of the viewer's gaze over the objectified body of the subject of the statue, while simultaneously affirming the worth and nobility of the art. Their label texts also receive them as artworks of high quality and significant meaning, promoting the statues themselves and failing to oppose the dangerous ideals which they stand for. The clear influence of the dying Gaul and the general concepts of the other and the noble savage in antiquity are important for us to recognize as scholars of the ancient world and its art. Catalogs for the sculptures featuring Indigenous peoples of the Americas often recall the dying Gaul and ideas from antiquity as sources of inspiration for these modern statues. But I have yet to come across any scholarship on the dying Gaul as an ancient source that mentions these harmful instances of reception of Indigenous peoples or of the sculpture. It is crucial for us to recognize and condemn these harmful perpetuations of Indigenous peoples as deserving of violent mistreatment and rightfully conquered. The prominent placement of such dangerous examples of reception in the US Capitol demonstrates the impact of ancient art and ideology on modern attitudes and even prominent placement of and even governmental policies. In order to reckon with this harmful past and prevent future instances of such problematic receptions, it is our responsibility to take notice of these issues and make clear why they are harmful and should no longer be tolerated. While some of the sculptures may have been removed from their prominent placements among the US Capitol, the Progress of Civilization pediment remains in place on the US Capitol East entrance, and the other works remain on display as important works of art in their respective museums, thus continuing to promote the original ideals of white supremacist nature and the oppression of Indigenous peoples. Ultimately, although some labels and catalog entries refer to the works as problematic or dangerous, there is little to no discussion of why this is the case or how exactly they have harmed Indigenous peoples of the Americas. These statues and their labels serve to marginalize Indigenous peoples and treat them as if they are merely symbols of a violent but justified past, ignoring the ongoing effects of colonization upon the descendants of Indigenous peoples of the Americas. The continued display and admiration of statues like these examples perpetuates harmful ethnic stereotypes and ideologies of white supremacism and colonialism. As long as these statues remain on display, the least we can do is work towards a reinterpretation via their label text, rather than simply accepting the idea of the noble savage as a positive thing, condemning it as a destructive stereotype. Perhaps this is a better solution than calling for the removal of the artworks entirely. Instead of targeting the statues themselves, perhaps what is more important is taking the time to fully understand their reception and the consequences of it, acknowledging where we have traditionally accepted harmful ideals as positive values. It is essential that we, as interpreters of the past, are being honest in our representation of history, even when that means addressing difficult, ugly truths. Passing over them in silence ultimately just makes us complicit. It is also important that we keep in mind that these harmful ideas that I've presented through modern art are rooted in the ancient ideals of ethnic supremacism and the violent colonization of Indigenous peoples in the ancient world. As scholars of that ancient past in particular, we should recognize and condemn such manipulations of ancient art and ideology in order to prevent further harms to Indigenous peoples of the Americas and other marginalized groups. We must stop simply tolerating these dangerous receptions of classical materials and speak out whenever we can, especially when the voices of those most impacted have been suppressed for so long. Thank you.